Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another Apereo Microconference. My name is Patrick Masson, and I'm the Executive Director for the Apereo Foundation. This session actually marks the end of our third year hosting these microconferences, and I'm amazed and I guess proud too of the success we've had. These events started as internal board discussions where we invited experts on open source, ed tech, higher ed, and the broader community to come in and help the board in their strategic planning. These events proved so informative and insightful that we decided to open them up to the Apereo community and, well, anyone actually interested in open source in and for education. So thank you for joining us. To date, as I said, this is our third year. We've had almost 1,400 registrations from almost 300 universities, 48 research institutions, 10 libraries, 26 companies across 46 countries. And I can't believe how successful we've been and the breadth of and variety of folks that we've had come and join us. So thank you all for joining us. I also want to thank Jen Cummings for her leadership in developing and organizing these events from day one. Kathy Acevedo, who has a growing amount of work in managing and supporting these sessions. And then also, of course, Michelle Hall for all of her efforts in promoting each of the microconferences across all of Apereo's channels. So I'd also be negligent in not talking a little bit about Apereo. For those who might be new on the call, Apereo is a nonprofit that's been around for 25 years with roots back to the Sakai and JSIG foundations. We have 95 institutions that are committing to the projects, 13 projects, 9,000 or 8,300 collaborators, and 63 now, I guess, contributors. And so it's a broad community, not just technologists, but also instructional designers and faculty and all sorts of folks working in education. So we're very fortunate to have that global community as part of the foundation. If you're interested in these sessions, please visit at the bottom of any Apereo webpage the little link there that says what does it say? Join Apereo Communications. And then also, if you want to support our work, please join as a member. We offer memberships for individuals and also companies and other nonprofit communities and universities. So if you do enjoy these and you appreciate the work that Apereo is doing in open source and higher ed, please pass this along to your company or institution, and maybe they will join us in our work. Next is I want to actually thank our sponsors that make this possible. JMA Consulting, that helps us with our Civi CRM. For those that don't know, it's an open source community management or community CRM, community relationship management tool, and they provide a lot of support for the platform that does the registrations, manages the events, and so on. And of course, Big Blue Button, which is what we're using right now. Thank you to Blindside Networks for their support of these events. And again, the Apereo community, all of you that are spreading the word and have made these so successful. So let's see. With that, let's get on with the main event, Sustaining Open Source in the Research Enterprise. And this is our closing session for the 2025 year. And today we'll explore the most pressing challenges facing the open source ecosystem, sustainability, particularly the software emerging from academic and research environments. I won't read their bios to you, they're right there, but I'll just note the context of this event. While open source tools are essential to innovation, collaboration, reproducibility, and research, many projects struggle to secure long-term support. Sustainability is often hindered by short-term funding cycles, a lack of institutional infrastructure, and difficulty in aligning research-driven development with community needs and maintenance. Without stable pathways for support, critical tools risk stagnation or even abandonment, as demand often grows with them. In this session, Dylan Ruediger and Chelsea McCracken, thank you for both being here, from Ithaka S+R, will share findings and recommendations from a workshop held in August 2025, co-hosted by Ithaka and Apereo and supported by the National Science Foundation, Sloan Foundation, and Chan Zuckerberg Initiative on open source sustainability in academia. Drawing on insights from these diverse stakeholders, developers, institutions, funders, and researchers, they'll highlight strategies for treating open source as essential research infrastructure, coordinating efforts across institutions, and embedding sustainability into the academic mission. Whether you're a developer, administrator, educator, funder, or scholar, you'll come away with, hopefully, with a clear understanding of the barriers to sustainability and practical models for ensuring open source software is thriving and supported in the research enterprise. So with that, I will hand it over and welcome Chelsea and Dylan. It was great having you, and I look forward to learning more. Let me give Chelsea the power, make presenter, and she should be good now. With that, I'll hand it over and I'll say goodbye from the screen for now.
Thanks, Patrick.
Just say, while Chelsea's getting this slide deck together, that we really are excited to be here, and we could not have done this project without Patrick and Josh and the rest of the folks at Apereo. It's been one of the pleasures of the year to get to work with them, and we're excited to talk today about some of the things that came to the surface at a workshop that we hosted in August in New York City. And Chelsea, if you want to go to the next slide. Ithaka S+R may not be familiar to folks in the audience, so I'll just say a couple of words about who we are and how we fit into this work. Ithaka S+R is a not-for-profit research organization. Our mission is to help academic and cultural communities and research communities understand what's coming next and to address kind of systematic and structural problems that hinder the academic mission and access to education. We tend to do this through very large-scale research studies and convenings similar to the one that we held here. And we have about 60 people working for Ithaka S+R at this point in time, including the team that is leading this work today, which focuses on the research enterprise. And Chelsea, if you want to go to the next slide. Just a few words about the Research Enterprise Program. We work on a pretty wide variety of topics that are at the intersection of the infrastructure that makes research possible, the technologies and methodologies that help people to learn and understand, and the communities that are conducting research. Our remit is much broader than open source software. It includes the projects that I've listed here, in addition to a great many others. But over the last couple of years, we've started to do some work in the arena of open source research software. Through this project and also through some work that we're doing with the Sloan Foundation to explore the successes and challenges of the university open source program offices that they've been funding around the country. So you can see from this, we're not really open source people. We are people who understand what's going on in higher ed generally and in the research space in particular. And I think you'll see that in the way that we approach things throughout this presentation. Next slide, please. A quick overview of what mostly Chelsea is going to share with you. We'll talk briefly about what the workshop looked like, and then we will share a report of some of the themes that surfaced throughout the day of conversation, most of which cluster around two different topics: what sustainability actually means, and where the challenges and the pain points are that make sustainability so difficult, for researchers who have developed open source software. Next slide, please. So the premise of this work is that a lot of the, you want to go to the next slide, Chelsea? There we go. Perfect. Thank you.
Sorry.
Yep. No, all good. All good. As I think most people in this room will know, open source software really powers a lot of not only higher ed, but really anybody who's using software anywhere. This work is really focused on a particular subset of open source software, which is software that's developed by researchers to help them do the research that they are doing. So these are often not people who are computer scientists or engineers, or even people who would necessarily identify as software developers or coders. They're more likely to think of themselves as biologists or chemists or geologists who need to use software that they develop on their own to do the work that they need to do. This kind of software is really important for as part of the broader movement towards open science, which really is heavily invested in open, transparent inputs and outputs from across the research cycle. And so it fits very well within the main currents of a lot of what we've seen going on in the research space over the last couple of decades. The particular challenge that this kind of software poses is that these researchers who are developing it tend to view software as a means towards an end. They're not people who are necessarily conversant with the kinds of knowledge that people like Patrick have about how to sustain open source software. They're often developing software that is fairly niche in its applications. And frankly, they often care much more about the research than they do about the software. But the NSF and other organizations that fund a lot of scientific research have recognized that these outputs are really important as outputs of the scientific process that deserve to be not only archived, but also sustained when they can be of value to larger communities. And that's kind of the problem space that this work is situated in. So what we did was we put together a small workshop with stakeholders to kind of chew on these problems together. And if you want to go to the next slide, Chelsea. This took the specific form of a one-day in-person workshop that was held this August in New York City. As Patrick already mentioned, this was co-organized by us and the Apereo Foundation, and we brought together 39 participants from a really great range of perspectives, including people who were researchers themselves or were staff in labs that developed open source software, people from administrative positions in higher ed, folks who had been involved in sustaining open source software from the educational or ed tech side of things, or enterprise level, who had insights to share about sustainability for projects that are rooted in higher ed, and also folks from the private sector and from nonprofit foundations who are engaged in this kind of work. I've already really mentioned most of the goals. So I'll just say that at this point, next slide, please. The last comment from me before I turn it over to Chelsea is to just share a little bit about what we're actually sharing today. So today's presentation is really focused on reporting out ideas that surfaced during the course of the workshop. And so it leans very heavily into ideas and observations that were made by the participants. And I will say that were made by participants in an environment that was specifically engineered to promote brainstorming. And so, you know, these ideas exist in various states of thought through itness, but they reflect a really rich tapestry of ideas that surfaced over the course of the day. Early next year, there are going to be 2 formal deliverables that we'll be putting out. The first is a public report that will be ready early in 2026 that shares our findings and insights, or a kind of synthesis of what we learned that day with recommendations for stakeholders. And then also, and Patrick and Josh are taking the lead on this second deliverable, a practical guide that's really focused on workflows and decision frameworks for people who are stakeholders in sustainability or for open source research software. So what you're getting today is a semi-digested, semi-synthesized version of the themes that really prioritizes hearing the voices of the participants who were in the room that day and their expert ideas and commentary. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chelsea.
Thanks, Dylan. And I can't see my screen, so just wanted to make sure you can hear me okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, hi, everyone. I'm going to just take a few minutes and summarize some of the major themes that we heard from participants throughout the day of the workshop, and then I'll dive into more detailed findings. So one of the themes that we heard repeated again and again is the idea of considering software to be scholarship. So the existing incentive structures for researchers are designed and set up and orchestrated around creating and reproducing and citing scholarship. And software is kind of it doesn't fit easily into the system that has been designed to further scholarship. It's kind of a strange fit, and so the existing system doesn't really recognize the value doesn't adequately recognize the value of this research software that's being created. So sustainability would definitely benefit from a movement to reform the existing incentive structure to make software a better fit, or to expand the definitions of scholarship to recognize software. Another theme that came up pretty often was the value of collaboration. So open source communities practices and communities are very well versed in practices of collaboration. Collaboration is also a big benefit of academia and sort of a direction that open science is headed. And so there's this sort of synergy between these two communities and their practices of collaboration. And in particular, the opportunity to form interdisciplinary teams working on research software that's presented by academia seems to be potentially valuable for sustainability. Then we have the issue of academia has a lot of students in it, and that the fact that there are a lot of students who might be willing to perform mundane tasks of software sustainability as part of the learning process, and in the process gain skills that they can then use in the workforce and in their future careers, seem to be a potentially fruitful area of mission alignment that could create opportunities for sustainability. Another idea that came up quite a lot was the idea of open source software as a form of infrastructure. Participants seem to be concerned about the current model of episodic grant funding, that it wasn't the best fit for the way that open source research software works. And participants seemed more interested in developing a funding model for open source research software that was based on the idea that it was more like infrastructure. So like how buildings and utilities are funded. Many of the ideas that people came up with a lot of ideas for how open source research software could be funded more like infrastructure. And not all of the ideas are potentially feasible in the short term, but the common underlying factor among all of the ideas was the idea that there needs to be a continuous, reliable funding stream for open source research software in order to make it sustainable. Another idea that came up again and again was some sort of system for categorizing and tagging software. Many participants mentioned this in many different contexts, and they had different ideas about what that system was for and what it would look like. But it seemed to be that the consensus seemed to be that it could be beneficial for an entity outside the academy to develop some sort of software catalog that would aid with discovery of existing software. A few other themes that came up, the theme of institution-wide coordination. there was a lot of discussion about who within an institution should be in charge of open source activity. Some folks proposed that it should be an administrator, others that it should be an open source program office that Dylan mentioned earlier. There was a lot of discussion of potential around the tech transfer office, as well as the library. So there wasn't a consensus on who should be in charge, and perhaps it would be a different person at each institution. But the important thing was that there was some central point for coordinating, someone whose job description included coordinating open source seemed to be beneficial for sustainability. And then, so that's within the institution. Then beyond the institution, the idea of connecting developers and open source research software communities with entities and organizations and people who are not within their existing institution, that the context for sustainability for this type of software should be broader than the individual institution. And then finally, this concept of sector-wide standards. One of the topics that was brought up very frequently was that how you define sustainability depends on what the goals of the project are, and that different project types should follow different roadmaps to sustainability, but that the developers of the open source research software may not be easily able to determine what type of software they're making. And so creating sector-wide guidelines, playbooks, or standards to help people figure out what sustainability would look like for their project would be beneficial to sustainability. So I'm just going to pause for a moment there before I jump in. Oh, we're doing questions at the end, aren't we? Sorry. Okay. All right. I'll move on now to the detailed findings. So the first section here is on how you define sustainability and what it means in the context of open source research software. This was what our participants at the workshop spent the first half of the workshop discussing. So in the morning sessions, we tried to define what sustainability is and tried to define what the main challenges of sustainability were. And in doing that, there seemed to be 4 different dimensions, 4 different ways that the participants spoke about sustainability for open source research software. And when they were thinking along each one of these dimensions, the context and the challenges of sustaining open source research software that emerged were different. So the 4 main ways that people were thinking of sustainability. The first one is motivational sustainability. So in this definition of sustainability, it's defined by purpose, by goals. So both what is the purpose of the software and why are people deciding to work on it? So this is very sort of mission or goal-oriented way of understanding sustainability. The second main way was archival. So this is where sustainability is understood as preservation in the scholarly record. So can you find out, can you go and research a piece of software in the archives and find out more about it? The third main way of understanding sustainability was relational sustainability. So here, sustainability is defined by the relationships between people and whether the community of people working on a project can continue, can self-perpetuate, can be resilient in the face of challenges. And then the fourth way of understanding sustainability was infrastructural. And in this definition, sustainability software is understood to be infrastructure. And so sustainability is understood as a sort of ecosystem of how resources flow to to that software and how that software is considered to be a communal resource. So I'm going to first talk about motivational sustainability. One of the main sort of questions with folks who have this understanding of sustainability is, why should you sustain an existing software project? There was a very memorable quote by Kat Allman in the workshop of, is your software a Q-tip or a hammer? So a Q-tip software would be one that is purpose-built to solve a specific research problem, and that notably is not intended for reuse like a Q-tip. But other software might be intentionally developed as a tool for others to use, more like a hammer, and that each of these different goals for the software would create different implications for sustainability. There's also, if you understand sustainability this way, there's also the question of what is the real world impact of the software? For instance, does the software itself solve a real world problem, or is the main purpose of the software to primarily around scientific transparency? And so each of these different impacts would have different implications for sustainability. And then finally, whether the code itself has many downstream dependencies. So like, should the code be kept unchanged, or should the software be intended to keep pace with science, in which case it should be updated frequently? So these are different, that's another way that understanding the goal of the software impacts how you understand sustainability. There's also a lot of discussion of why people might decide to work on an open source research project. The two traditional understandings of reasons why people work on open source, one of them is that they're motivated by enjoyment or the fulfillment of a personal need. But for those folks, it can be difficult to want to do the mundane tasks that are required to sustain a project. On the other hand, you have people who are motivated by sort of extrinsic rewards, such as money. And for those people, that there can be difficulty retaining them long-term on a project. So there was some discussion of in the workshop of the role of research software engineers in the development of open source research software. These are folks who are paid to develop research software, but may or may not be open source aligned. And their role in creating and maintaining open source research software. And then we have, in the academic context, we have further additional personal motivations that people might have. For example, students might have the motivation of learning. Faculty might have the motivation of academic incentives, such as retention, tenure, and promotion. And researchers might have the motive of utility, of solving a research problem so that they can continue with their research. So that is motivational sustainability. We also talked about archival sustainability. So in this sense, sustainability is defined by ensuring that software can be cataloged, tracked, and properly attributed. In the interest of open science, the software used to produce research findings needs to be discoverable, in particular for publicly funded research. But there aren't the existing systems for finding and discovering the software are not as robust as they are for standard scholarship. There's some organizations that are working on this, but it's still potentially challenging. Then there's the issue of when a researcher decides to reuse software, how do they decide which software to use? Usage could be an indicator that In other words, the number of other people that are using software might be an indicator that it's a good software to use for your research purpose, but usage itself is very difficult to track, as we'll discuss later. And then finally, the existing practice of citing scholarship in the scholarly record doesn't map very well onto the context of software. So it can be difficult to determine, for example, who is the author of scholarship and therefore how to write your citation. So these were some of the challenges that came up when we discussed for folks who define sustainability in terms of its archival sustainability. In terms of relational sustainability, these were some of the challenges that people identified for open source research software. There can be, as Dylan mentioned, there's a lack of knowledge about how open source communities are run among the developers of this research software. So there's, there may be standardized playbooks, but they may not have access to them. They may not know they exist. There's also questions or challenges around leadership changeover, the governance of communities, that communities need to be welcoming to new members to be sustainable over time, and how to make them welcoming. And then issues of internal communication within an open source community, and also cultures, for example, potentially, friction between open source values and academic values, in cultural clashes. So these were some of the challenges that emerged around understanding and defining relational sustainability. And then we have infrastructural sustainability, understanding research software, open source research software as common property. And so some of the issues that came up here are the lack of awareness, the inability to determine who's responsible for sustaining something that is a common resource, and as well as understanding what the dependencies are within the ecosystem of open source. And when participants took the view of understanding sustainability as infrastructural, one of the main topics that they talked about is funding, and how the year-to-year episodic grant funding can create sustainability problems. And participants pointed to examples of existing infrastructure, such as roads and buildings that might be funded by government appropriations, or university systems that might be funded by indirects or endowments, or existing infrastructure that might be funded by crowdfunding. So participants were interested in examining these alternative models of funding found for existing infrastructure as potential ideas for funding open source research software. There were also as I mentioned before, there was also a lot of interest around the potential of the tech transfer office, as it is existing infrastructure at many colleges and universities that could potentially be repurposed or added on to assist in creating sustainable funding systems for open source research software. So in summary, the 5 main challenges that emerged in the workshop, in the first half of the workshop, were related to cultural barriers, responsibility, usage, the value proposition, and extra institutional support. So I'll go over the proposed solutions for each of these challenges, but just to reiterate what Dylan said, these represent brainstorming and have not been screened for feasibility. So the first challenge was around open culture and its potential compatibility or lack thereof with academic culture. Some of the proposed solutions in this regard revolved around reforming the existing system for retention, tenure, and promotion, academic incentives, so that software fit in better with the existing incentive system, or so that the incentive system better recognized software. This would also include reform among funders and publishers. There was also some discussion of community management as a solution to cultural issues such as codes of conduct and internal communication. But this was an area that we felt needed potentially further development in the workshop. The second challenge that the workshop participants worked on is responsibility. And here participants were pretty clear that there should first be some sort of system-wide standardized process for determining whether open source research software should be maintained, and if so, how many resources should be allocated to it. So before even determining who was responsible for maintaining it, you need to determine whether it should be maintained and how. Participants were also clear that responsibility for sustaining open source research software exists at all levels, from the local to the global. So at the project level of individual researchers and users, there is potential to incorporate student labor, for instance, coursework, independent study, internships, work study, and to give students instruction for and credit for their work on open source research software projects. At the institutional level, there was a lot of agreement that it was important to establish some sort of campus leader or group to coordinate open source activity. There was not a consensus on who this should be. There was some discussion that it could be the Open Source Program Office, that it could be the Tech Transfer Office, that these two offices could merge, that it could be the library, or that it could be some senior level administrator, and that person would be, or that office would be responsible for a variety of open source activities on campus. Then at the research enterprise level, participants felt that most expansion was needed at this level in order to ensure sustainability. And they came up with many ideas for how this could work. There was a lot of interest in the European system, which is developing, of funding open source maintenance through government appropriations. This is unlikely to be feasible in the US at this time. There was also a lot of ideas that seem to sort of revolve around an endowment model, where funders or users would place a percentage of award money in an endowment, which would pay for long-term maintenance, or that stakeholders would pay into a common fund. There's also interest in the FOSS fund model, where employees would vote on which projects to fund. Employees in private industry or potentially folks in nonprofits would vote on which projects to fund. And then the importance of not just funding, but providing labor at the research enterprise level. So assistance, expertise to researchers who are working with open source research software. Our third challenge was around the paradox of usage. So usage data for open source research software is similar in importance to understanding the impact factor of traditional scholarship. So that means that it's sort of prestige, it's trustworthiness, and its sort of ubiquity. And these are similar metrics for evaluating that in traditional scholarship and in software. However, its many methods for collecting usage data for software go counter to open source values. And so participants were very interested in developing solutions to this sort of paradox, including technical methods for measuring how many people are using software, and then more direct methods such as market research and system level mapping. So the direct methods were divided into two. Some of them were within a given institution, partnering with the IT department. They could run a port scan of the software as it was being used on campus. And then there was other ideas for how understanding how software on a given campus is being used on other campuses. So you can see some of the ideas there on the screen. In terms of more indirect methods of measurement, participants suggested market research on data that already exists from testimonials and discussion forums, or collecting new data by interviewing users. There was also interest in some sort of system level mapping or developing a knowledge graph using digital repositories or funders' existing records to create some kind of database of existing software to understand the relationships between different applications. Our fourth challenge was developing a value proposition for why universities should care about open source research software. And this was also an area, one of the participants said, that developing a value proposition was maybe the most important thing that could come out of the workshop. So participants came up with some ideas for what this could look like. They were interested in the mission alignment between open source research software and universities' teaching and learning and research missions. They were also interested in the potential reputational benefits of creating a public good that is available to the public, and also that offers a way to compete for prestige with their fellow institutions. However, this was another area from the workshop that we felt could use further development. And then finally, our last challenge that participants discussed was about extra institutional support that is needed to sustain open source research software. The two main categories of support that participants thought were needed were leadership, and that could take the form of some sort of consulting service, functional tools and information resources, training networks, or some sort of leadership by funders in developing new funding models. And then also some sort of cataloging system, as this has come up a lot, but some sort of system to help researchers identify whether their software was novel, or to understand how it's being used, or calculate its impact factor. There are a variety of different proposals around cataloging, but it seemed to be that some sort of system developed outside the academy would be most useful. So I'm now going to hand it back off to Dylan to wrap us up.
Thanks, Chelsea. I'll be very brief and cryptic with these, but they're a little preview of what's coming next year. Three kind of takeaways that we're thinking through as we move forward with this. First of all, that sustaining open source research software is a really thorny problem, and it's going to take a lot of time and investment to really figure this out. We think about this in relation a lot to similar work that's been done over the last couple of decades on open access publications and data sharing, both of which have required really sustained hard work and investment and prioritization to make progress possible. I think one of the things that's clear to us is that this problem is similar in its scale and its complexity to those challenges. A second thing is that the key communities who will need to work together to make open source research software sustainable may not yet really fully understand the motivations, the goals, the workforces, the priorities of other stakeholders and collaborators, and that there seems to be a real need and an opportunity to continue bringing communities together like we did in August to help them more deeply understand each other. And then the last one, and Chelsea already alluded to this, is that we had a lot of trouble at the workshop really zeroing in on a value proposition for university leaders that would be compelling to encourage them to invest their own time and internal resources in this kind of work. And this is a clear kind of starting point. Another place that it will be really useful to have this conversation continue is to hone in and articulate why this should matter to institutions if we're asking them to accept more responsibility in this area. And with that, I will turn it over to questions. And I don't know, Patrick, are you emceeing this?
Yes, I'll be happy to. We did have one question. It's in the chat. I'll read it just in case people don't have the chat open. It's from Lauren. I wonder if you can talk more about the shared labor concept from the second challenges section. What are the kinds of activities and labor that could be shared or provided to open source research software? Were there any particular areas of expertise that they needed? Is there any analogous model that you encountered in your research? Is this something like a fiscal sponsor that might provide HR, financial assistance to a nonprofit or independent organization?
I guess I'm not, I don't entirely understand the question about shared labor.
Maybe I just recollection from the conference or from the workshop. There were discussions about were there whether this was the student aspect of shared labor, and I don't remember what was on the slide specifically, but could researchers engage students in different areas, whether they're grad students working within their labs, or maybe even students who are in other disciplines, marketing students or business students that can help with making the projects available beyond the campus. So there are those sort of student level activities, and looking at it as free labor. But then shared labor could have been if you already had an open educational resource group in your library, could you work with that group to understand best practices in creating communities? If you had folks on campus that were already doing events planning and management, could you engage with those folks to help with meetups or conferences or things about your discipline and the use of open source or your particular project's open source software? So I think there was an inner campus level, and then could there be shared resources made available through discipline? So I think of the GIS community and others that have open source projects that span the discipline. And then finally, was there opportunities for OSPOs, for example, to combine resources and expertise on one campus that might have expertise in grants, or access to grant and development officers, and then another one has access to I don't know, it could be again the communications folks or the marketing or events management, whatever it be. So are there opportunities to extend the resources through a collaborative effort? I think that's what we're discussing.
Patrick, Lauren clarified the part. Okay, the particular bullet point that Lauren was asking about was about that some research, open source research software projects, they're being maybe developed or worked on by people who are not software developers and people who are like not experts. And so that particular bullet point was about entities outside of the institution being able to provide like rent a research software engineer type services, so that like non-software developers who are developing software could have that expertise sort of parachute in and help them solve problems. I think that was one of the areas that was discussed.
Right. So being true to the discussion, trying to recall, and I think Claire is on the line too, and she was there, but I think that was one potential value of the OSPOs on campus, to provide support services for perhaps graduate students or others, or even faculty researchers who didn't have experience working with or in open source communities. And it might sound like I'm touting Apereo's horn here, or tooting Apereo's horn, but that there could be other foundations that are involved, whether that's, again, discipline specific, like the GIS, OpenGIS, I forget what the name of that group is, or maybe it's a hardware infrastructure folks that are have expertise in different areas. So perhaps working with an external foundation is another resource that was identified as just potential options. Any other questions? Oh, Ben, not a question, but I love the discussion of different aspects of sustainability. We often talk about sustainability as a single thing, but there's a lot that goes into it. Any more just thing to add, Chelsea or Dylan there?
Only that I'm glad you like that point. I think it's maybe especially pertinent when you move into things like research software, where the motivations of the people who find themselves creating this code, they don't necessarily consider themselves to be software developers. They don't necessarily understand the communities around open source, and they're likely to be as motivated by things like open science principles and other things. So I think that as it kind of shifts into researchers as the people who are creating it, that the motivational issue becomes even more important, and possibly a little more variegated than it might be in some other contexts. Though I think much of what we've identified probably applies to those as well, but I do think there's something here that's maybe not unique, but specific and distinctive about the research context.
I also was struck by how like when people were thinking of a different definition of sustainability, they kind of would talk past each other, like that these different ways of understanding sustainability just completely like made you think of different questions and made you think of different challenges, and that everybody sort of had a different sense of what it meant.
A last thought on this is that the archival sustainability seems to be really important to me. A lot of the software that the NSF's POSE program and the Sloan Foundation and others are interested in trying to find ways to sustain is software that's not written to be used very widely, and may not be very useful outside of really highly specialized contexts. And so if we often think about sustainability as kind of like, is it growing? Is it maintained? Does it have a user base? Does it have a contributor base? Like, some of these outputs may not have enough critical mass to make that even a plausible way of thinking about what it means to sustain it. And then at that point, it becomes much more about like, is it accessible for reproducibility reasons? Is it, like being cataloged in a way that if someone wants to find it, they're able to do so? Maybe it has an unexpected second life, but it's not. Much of this software probably won't turn into WordPress. It's just not built to serve that kind of functionality. And so the sustainability becomes a little more nuanced.
There was a follow-up looking forward. I am also from Lauren again, I am also very interested in the cataloging need. Will you have more details on this in a future report or other output? I work for Invest in Open Infrastructure. Just jumped. Where to go? And we have some examples of research software listed in our Infra Finder catalog. I would love to learn more so we can potentially say how the needs map on what we already have.
Yeah, the report should include more details on the different. There were a lot of different potential models for like why you would need a catalog and what it would be for, and there was not a lot of consensus on what that would be, and there were even some folks who said no, you actually don't need a catalog, but the report will include more details about what those different needs that were identified were.
Claire follows up. That is an excellent point, Dylan. All the insights about how the usual discussions about solving sustainability in general open source software projects don't necessarily carry across to these niche areas.
Well, thank you. I think that, to me, that's a really helpful way of thinking. But I also think part of what was really interesting about this workshop was trying to find out where they do, like researchers who are not familiar with the open source world may really benefit from people who have spun up things that did have a shelf life and some like long-term durability. Whereas if they're trying to invent that on their own, they may get absolutely nowhere. So I do think there are some really distinctive things here, but I think there's also an issue of connecting people who have expertise and experience developing I guess I'll call conventionally sustainable open source software. There's things they can learn from them as well.
Well, we just hit the top of the hour, so I will rudely cut things off, I guess, here. But I do want to thank Chelsea and Dylan, not only for today, but all of the support you and Ithaka have provided to not just Apereo, but the open source research, software development, maintenance community, the emerging folks there. And we will have, as Chelsea and Dylan noted, the report coming out beginning of January, and also the guidelines. And those, I'm excited to share, to get the feedback as well. It'll be interesting to see what discussions are prompted by the release of those. So once again, Chelsea and Dylan, thank you so much for your time today and the work that you've provided us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Happy holidays.
Bye.